Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and this is the Found in Print Italian American Stories podcast. Today's story is about Concetto Formica. He was an Italian American that was tragically killed while working as a musician in a carnival. Sadly, after his death, he became known as the Italian Mummy when his body was held for 61 years by the local funeral director. This tragic situation took place down south in North Carolina, which means I have finally gotten out of Colorado and am telling a story in a new state. I have to admit, it is a little hard to get out of Colorado for me. I was born and raised here. It's easy for me to find stories about Italian Americans, but I'm working on it, and like I said, today we are down south in North Carolina. So let's get into the story of Concetto Formica. Concetto was born in Sortina, Sicily on September 26, 1888. His parents were Vincenzo Formica and Pasqua Castelli. Now, there are a lot of different names given to Concetto by newspapers and different publications. I'll go over some of the names and give an explanation for why I'm referring to him as Concetto Formica. But here are a couple of the more common names that I saw. One is Ferenzio Concetto, and the other one is Formico Concetto. But like I said, I am choosing to call him Concetto Formica because 1, the last name matches his father's name. 2, his military records in New York have his name listed as Concetto Formica. And 3, his probate records show his name listed as Concetto. And I found some ship manifests that also have his name listed as Concetto Formica. Now, I could be wrong, and I could be calling him by the wrong name, but I feel comfortable calling him by Concetto Formica because, like I said, I found numerous documents with that same name listed, so I'm going to go ahead and call him Concetto Formica from here on out. Concetto arrived in America on June 17, 1907, when he was 18. He came 2 years before his father came to America. I'm not sure if his mother actually came to America. I could not find a lot of information on her. In fact, it kind of looks like she didn't come to America, but I don't know. I could be wrong. When he came to America, he settled in New York City for the first couple of years he was here. In 1909, he did join the New York Guard Services, and he was 21 years old when he joined them. He was in the band, in the Guard, and his rank was private. But sometime between 1909 and 1911, Concetto joined the Metropolitan Carnival Company, where he was a musician in the carnival, and he played the trumpet. It looks like from everything I read, the carnival, it was a traveling carnival, traveled from state to state, city to city. So in April of 1911, Concetto found himself in the South, particularly South Carolina. Now, I know I said that we were in North Carolina, but we will only be in South Carolina for just a little bit, and then we're jumping over to North Carolina. I don't have a lot of information on Concetto in his early years in America, other than his military service. I couldn't find much on his life before his death in 1911 in the newspapers. I think because he wasn't in America that long, and he did start working for a carnival that travels, so that can make it hard to find information on him. However, I did find one article from September 10th, 1950, and it was published in the Durham Morning Herald, and it gave some background information on Concetto's personality. Apparently, the author of the article was able to interview some of Concetto's workers who also worked for the carnival, and one of the workers described Concetto as a troublemaker. Apparently, he liked to play tricks on others. He would spy on the other workers and then go and tell stories about them. Of course, keep in mind this is just one person's perspective of Concetto, and I couldn't even verify who this person was, but it is kind of interesting and gives a little bit of possible insight, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but on who Concetto was and the event leading up to his death. Anyways, in April of 1911, the carnival workers were setting up their tents and getting ready for a carnival in McCall, South Carolina. Concetto was helping set up the tents, and somehow an argument broke out between him and another band member named Giuseppe Latoro. Apparently, Giuseppe didn't like Concetto's antics and told him to leave him alone. It was said that Giuseppe was a sad fellow who would sit alone in his tent and read letters from his family in Italy, and apparently he was always praying and holding his rosary. So one day, Concetto apparently saw Giuseppe sitting in his tent alone reading letters, and Concetto snuck into the tent and grabbed the letter that Giuseppe was reading and took off running. This did not sit well with Giuseppe. It made him pretty angry, and he got up and started chasing Concetto. And Concetto kept running. He was only about 5 feet tall, and I guess Giuseppe was a little bit bigger than him, so Concetto kept running because he was, I don't know, probably feared that he would maybe get beat up a little bit. But unfortunately, when Concetto was running, he tripped over one of the ropes holding a tent down and fell to the ground. Giuseppe was able to catch up to him at this point, and there was a tent stake laying on the ground near Concetto, and Giuseppe picked up the tent stake and he hit Concetto over the head with it. Now, the tent stake was described as being about 3 feet long, it was wooden, and it had a metal ring on it. And I think that he hit Concetto with the metal ring because Concetto's wound was described as being about the size of a baseball indent in his head, if that makes sense. So Concetto fell immediately unconscious, and he was taken by wagon to Scotland Hospital in Laurinburg, North Carolina. And he only lived for about 12 hours after the incident and passed away in the hospital at the age of 23. And apparently this day was April 28th, 1911. I found a few other dates, but April 28th was the most common date that I found. The hospital called the M.A. McDougald Funeral Home to come and get Concetto's body. John McDougald was the one who came and got the body, and the proprietor of the Metropolitan Carnival Company instructed John to go ahead and embalm the body. John was able to get a hold of Concetto's father, Vincenzo, who was actually traveling with a different carnival at this time, but he did get a hold of him and informed him of his son's death. And Vincenzo, he arrived at the funeral home a few days later with an interpreter. And Vincenzo paid a $20 deposit on the $42 bill, and he promised to pay the rest in a few days, but he also told John that he needed to get a hold of their family that was still in Italy to see what they should do with the body. But according to John, he never heard from Vincenzo again. I also read an article, though, where John told a reporter that, quote, "When I got the $20 down in my jeans, I got mean. I told him he wasn't going to get anything until he paid the rest of the bill." I don't like this response from John at all. This does not seem very nice. So the reporter in the article then followed up with a question to John, and he asked how Vincenzo reacted to this, and John said, quote, "Oh hell, he came back, then cried a little, but when he found out he was going to have to put out money, it was a different tune, and that dried up his tears." I don't like that answer from John either. That's not great. John also showed the reporter a contract he had Vincenzo sign. And I'll go ahead and read the portion of the contract that was actually published in the article. And it says, "This empowers M.A. McDougald to hold my son's body until he is fully satisfied for services rendered, and that I agree to send balance due on above in a reasonable length of time. If not in a reasonable length of time, then M.A. McDougald will dispose of the body as he wishes, to be buried in Town Cemetery of Laurinburg, North Carolina. Signed, Vincenzo Formica." But John never heard from Vincenzo again. However, he did receive a letter from the family in Italy asking for the body to be sent to Italy. The family also requested that Concetto not be buried in an American cemetery that is not Catholic. I'm guessing the family added this into the letter in the case that Concetto's body could not be sent back to Italy. And I actually listened to an interview on what was called funeral radio. I didn't know that existed, but it was a cool interview, so I'm glad I found it. And the interview was with John McDougald's grandson, Beecham, and he explained the circumstances of what happened with Concetto's body. Beecham claimed that after his grandfather received the letter, he had to find an interpreter to write a letter back to the family. So he was able to find an Italian Catholic priest that was willing to help him write a letter. And the letter that John sent back to the family informed them that, there's going to be a few costs if you want to get the body back to Italy. He, informed them of the cost of a coffin, the cost of the train ride to get the body to a ship, and the cost to ship the body to Italy. Beecham said his grandfather also told the family that there were no Catholic cemeteries in North Carolina at that time. But John never heard back from the family in Italy either, and Concetto's father never came back to claim the body. So Concetto's body remained with the McDougals. And like I said earlier, they'd already embalmed his body, and so he eventually mummified, or as Beecham put it, all the moisture evaporated from his body. So the McDougals left the body in the embalming room at the funeral home, and, they didn't put it in a coffin or a box. Instead, they tied a rope around Concetto's chest and hung him up on the wall in the embalming room. I don't know. It's kind of strange. So after a few years, they eventually moved Concetto's body to a box instead of just being strapped up to the wall by a rope. And John McDougald said that he couldn't bury Concetto because he promised Vincenzo, which was Concetto's father, he would not bury him without further instructions from the family. And when I say after a few years, it was 1939 when they moved his body from the wall to a box. So it was a little bit more than a few years because Concetto died in 1911. But Concetto still remained with the family, and he honestly kind of became part of the local legends, myths in Laurinburg, North Carolina. But he still remained with the family. They did not bury him even after moving him to a box. And honestly, he just became part of the local flair in Laurinburg, North Carolina. And the McDougald family moved Concetto's body then from this box, and I don't know what this box was. I don't know if it was a wooden coffin or cardboard box, but they did move him from that box to a glass case. And they actually ended up placing him in the funeral home's garage. And once he was in the garage, he was basically put on display for the town to come and see. Beecham said in his interview that basically there wasn't a lot to do in, North Carolina at that time. They lived in a really small town. I'm sure it was just all farms, that kind of stuff. And he said there wasn't a lot to do for people. So on Friday and Saturday nights, the McDougalds would leave the garage open for the locals to come look at Concetto. I mean, I guess, I don't know. But he said that people would go into the garage, open up Concetto's glass case, and take a peek at him. And this would go on every Friday and Saturday night until 9 o'clock. Then they would shut off the lights and close the garage door, and I guess the evening activities were done in that town at that time. Beecham went on to explain in that interview that Concetto eventually became known to the locals as Spaghetti, and he said it was basically because Concetto Formica was too exotic of a name for the locals to pronounce at that time. And when I looked into the history of this town, it was settled by Scottish people. So, there wasn't a lot of Italians there, and they just decided to call him Spaghetti instead. I will continue to call him Concetto from this point on, but I thought I would put that out there because if you do look up, Concetto, you will see that he was called Spaghetti. And honestly, at this point, I'm not going to lie. I'm feeling just a little sad and irritated, and I know it was a different time, but this poor man is not laid to rest, and they can't even call him by his own name. And honestly, I don't think, or at least I hope, that the McDougald family didn't do all of this out of disrespect or as a way to gain fame or to earn money. And I really don't want to rag on this family because maybe they did have good intentions. And like I said, it was a different time. But letting people come in and open up his case and view him, and that's just a whole nother ballgame. Also, I go back to the contract that McDougald had Vincenzo sign. It clearly states that the body will be buried if the balance is not paid. But for some reason, McDougald didn't do that. He kept the body and he put it on display. I couldn't find anything that said he was charging people to come look at the body, but I kind of wonder if he was doing it as a way to gain fame in the area. I don't know. But back to the interview with McDougald's grandson, Beecham. He did recall a couple of interesting stories about Concetto. The first story he told was how one year the funeral home added an intercom system to the entire building, including the garage where Concetto was. And there were two neighborhood boys named Sandy and Doug who always came around to check out Concetto. Well, one day, Beecham's father dared Doug, who was said to be the brave one out of the two boys, to stay in the garage for 10 minutes in the dark and keep Concetto's glass case open the whole time. And Doug, he quickly agreed to this. He wasn't scared of Concetto. He'd always been around. He'd seen Concetto. So he agreed to it. And once Doug was in the garage, the dark garage, Beecham's father got on the intercom and said, "Doug, get me out of here. Help." And so, of course, Doug did not know the intercom system was there, and it freaked Doug out, and he apparently ran out of the garage, ran all the way home, and hid under his bed. It's just, oh boy, I don't know. The second story Beecham told was about a time when he was home from college, and I guess he was just kind of sitting outside the house / funeral home, watching people walk in and out of the garage to look at Concetto. And I think that he had a little bit of a prankster streak in him like his father, because he came up with an idea to scare the looky-loos that were coming to look at Concetto. He got a large piece of cardboard and cut it out into the shape of a body, basically the same shape and size of Concetto's body. Then he dyed the cardboard with brown shoe polish to match Concetto's skin color. He then placed the cardboard cutout in front of Concetto's case and tied a string to the cardboard head. So basically, this cardboard cutout of Concetto was basically standing in front of the glass case. And he had a string that he tied to the head. So when people would approach what they thought was Concetto, Beecham would pull on the string, making it look like Concetto was moving. And he said that he was getting a pretty good kick out of it all until someone fell back against his dad's car, denting the hood, and then he knew that the fun was over and he was probably in a little bit of trouble. So as much as I hate the fact that Concetto's body was exploited and not put to rest and called spaghetti, I probably would have laughed watching the people run out of the garage too, I'm not going to lie. And Beecham, he knows. He even explained that he knows that this whole situation probably seems strange to most people. But for him, he said Concetto's body was in their garage his whole life, so it was not a big deal to him. He even kind of looked at Concetto as oddly a part of their own family. But life went on for the McDougals and the residents of Laurinburg in North Carolina. And like I said, Concetto, he remained a part of that community for 61 years. So he was not laid to rest for 61 years. He basically was just with the McDougals in their funeral home, and people in Laurinburg came to see him. But that changed in 1972 because an Italian congressman, Mario Biaggi from New York, came to Concetto's rescue. Mario was shocked when he learned about Concetto's story, and he felt like it was extremely disrespectful and that Italians were being slandered. And he was actually quoted saying in an article that the entire matter is shocking to say the least and does not reflect on the good sense and Christian character of the great state of North Carolina. He also called it a ghoulish attraction, which I agree, that's a really good way to put it. So after a lot of phone calls from Mario, steps started being put in place to finally put Concetto to rest. Biagio wanted to know the exact amount that it would cost to bury Concetto. And McDougall, he said that he wasn't sure of the exact cost, but told Mario that a 25-cent a day storage fee was reasonable. That's what he thought. But if you take 25 cents and you multiply it by 365 days, and then multiply it by 61 years, that comes out to $5,505.25. And that was in 1972. If that was today, that amount would be really close to $40,000, which is a lot of money. So Mario, he kept pushing it, and he went head-to-head with a lot of people in North Carolina. He called congressmen in North Carolina to help him out. He even, talked to reporters to try to get the story out there a little bit more. And honestly, he went head-to-head with a lot of people from North Carolina. And one reporter that he really went head-to-head with was a reporter from Raleigh, North Carolina, and his name was Jack Allis. And Jack really infuriated Mario when he wrote an article about Concetto claiming, "Everybody in Laurinburg calls the corpse spaghetti. It may be an ethnic slur, but it's easier than trying to remember or to pronounce Forenzio Concipio." So, okay, first of all, that's not even his real name. And is this guy serious? He literally says he knows it's an ethnic slur, but basically he doesn't care because spaghetti is easier to say. So it was this kind of stuff that Mario kept talking about. He kept saying like, this is disrespectful. This man needs to be laid to rest. We're calling him spaghetti, even though we know it's an ethnic slur. So he really, really pushed and kind of exploited this situation in a way, and the way that people were viewing Concetto. So Mario did end up writing back to Allis and says the whole affair is an insult. And which I agree. I mean, it honestly, it really is. It's actually kind of a sad situation when you think about it. And another person that he went head to head with was John Beecham's granddaughter, Isla Dalrympe. And she was extremely upset with Mario. And she had an interview where she talked about how she felt that Mario was basically making the story sound a lot worse than what it really was. And she claimed that this controversy made it seem like her family was trying to make money off of Concetto by either charging people to come see his body or by getting others to pay for the burial. She insisted both were not true. Like I said, I couldn't find anything on them charging people to come look at the body, but maybe there's other motives there, like fame. Anyways, she also told a reporter that spaghetti, and that's what she called him in the interview, was a part of her family. She even said that she took field trips with her school to her own family home to visit Concetto. And she hated the idea of him being buried and insisted that most of the town would agree with her. She even went on to claim that she sees no differences with keeping Concetto in their home, versus digging up mummies in like Egypt and putting them in a museum. I don't even know what to say to that. No comment, basically. But Mario was able to also get the North Carolina State Board of Funeral Directors and Embalmers involved in the situation. And so the North Carolina State Board of Funeral Directors told the McDougalls that they had to take the body down. Like, no more putting it on display. It needs to be taken down. And the executive director of the board told them that they are most likely violating state law by displaying the body. I mean, sure, yeah, probably violating state law, but what about ethics? That's kind of where I'm wondering, but whatever. McDougald explained to the State Board of Funeral Directors that he was still awaiting further burial instructions from the family, and he thought it may be illegal for him to bury the body without the family's permission. It's been 61 years since Concetto has died, and I keep going back to that contract that Vincenzo signed. And like I said, it basically said that the body became the property of the McDougalls. So, in my opinion, he didn't need to worry about getting in trouble with the family. He, for lack of a better expression, owned the body. And so he could have buried the body. He could have laid Concetto to rest. But McDougald decided that he did want to receive permission, I guess you could say. And so he received a ruling from a judge in North Carolina to bury Concetto. And on September 30th, 1972, Concetto was buried at the Hillside Cemetery in North Carolina. And about 100 people showed up for the service, and it was a Catholic service, so I was happy to hear that. And the funeral home, they did pay for the headstone. And once the coffin was laid in the ground, they actually filled it up with 2 tons of concrete to ensure that nobody would mess with the body. They were worried that people would come and, try to take Concetto, which I understand why they were worried about that, but 2 tons of concrete, it's, I don't know, kind of a creepy feeling to me. So I want to talk a little bit about, before we end the episode, about the man who actually killed Concetto. And I tried to find information on him, and his name was Giuseppe Lautaro, but I didn't have a whole lot of luck. Honestly, I feel like I was even lucky to find his name. I had to search a newspaper database using the keywords carnival and murder, and then had to narrow it down by the state of Carolina and the date, which was 1911. But other than that, I couldn't find any other news articles on him. And once I did find an article on him, the article pretty much just said, he was the one that killed Concetto, and gave his name and said that he was arrested. And that was pretty much it. But other than that, I couldn't find any other news articles on him. And looking him up on Ancestry.com was near impossible because I had no date of birth or relative information. And of course, there were multiple people with that same name. But I did find an article where McDougald was being interviewed by a reporter from the Star News. And he stated he didn't know much about the killer except that he was caught and set loose fairly soon after the murder. And basically, McDougald implied because Giuseppe and Concetto were both not citizens of America, they felt that it would be too hard to try and convict Giuseppe. So they decided that it would be best to just let Giuseppe go. I have no idea how true that is. Like I said, that was an interview done in 1950 with McDougald, which was years later. So take that with a big grain of salt. But I did run across one more thing that I want to talk about. And it was briefly mentioned in an article. I can't even remember which article it was, but they were talking about Concetto and his glass case, and they said that, the tent stake that killed him was always in the glass case as well. So, okay, kind of creepy to think about being stuck eternally with the weapon that killed you, but whatever. But believe it or not, that was not the weirdest thing that I found in this article. The author also said that there were the bodies of 2 premature babies who were born by C-section. But, obviously they didn't live. So these 2 babies, they were twins. They were born premature by C-section, and their mom didn't survive. And then I think the babies only lived maybe a day, and then they passed away. So somehow the McDougalls ended up with these bodies, and they weren't buried, and they stayed in the coffin, the glass case, with Concetto for years. This blew me away, and it still blows me away. I have no idea if this is true. I couldn't find any more info on it, but I wanted to mention it. And honestly, I understand that Concetto is a controversy, but why are these 2 babies not a controversy? Why were they not buried? Why were people not talking about these 2 little tiny babies that were sitting at the feet of Concetto in his glass case? Maybe it's not true, and maybe that's why nobody talked about it. But where's their mother? If the mother passed away, did they bury her body? And why couldn't they bury the babies with her body? I don't know. I have so many questions about this this scenario. I don't know. I have so many questions about this, and maybe it's just not true. I don't know. But I wanted to throw it out there because it's just one more kind of morbid thing to add to this story. So I don't know. This story, it just gets stranger and stranger. But I am grateful for Mario Biaggi and his push to have Concetto laid to rest. Even though he was a politician in New York, he recognized that the situation in North Carolina needed to be addressed and fixed. Now, I do want to talk about one more thing. I want to talk about Concetto's father, because I kept wondering why Vincenzo never showed back up to the funeral home. Why didn't he come try to finish paying off the balance to make sure that his son was buried? It just kind of kept crossing my mind. So I looked into it, and well, like I said earlier, this story gets stranger and stranger. I found that on March 10th, 1912, so less than a year after Concetto's death, Vincenzo was found dead on a sidewalk in Decatur, Alabama. His cause of death was a blow to the head, just like his son. So next week, we'll dive into the story of Vincenzo Formica. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to the story of Concetto Formica, and I hope you come back to listen to more stories about Italian Americans. See you next time.